Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we're continuing with our weekly series of Shirim on the Ramchal's Adir BaMarom, and we're starting Parak Vav today, which is going to be bringing us into the very beginnings of Olam HaNikudim. Everything we've spoken about thus far, leading us up to the Seder of the Hishtalshalus, is the Chalal of the Tzimtzum, and the emergence of the Rishimu, the irreducible trace of godliness, and the re-entry point of the Kav back into the Chalal, and the hamshacha of the or, of the gar and the vak through that kav, and ultimately how all that we're always talking about is the vavke of existence, is the halal and the kav, and the yudke that we draw down from the transcendental moichin are really the borrowed lights of the true moichin that we schlep down into our consciousness. And we're still not yet at the point of the emergence of human volitionality. That's the entire purpose of the Ijarabba. The Ijarabba is discussing the interrelationship between Atika and Zer Anpin, and how ultimately, like the Ramchal described to us, that this is a transition into the derech of Ahava, to go down from the worlds of infiniteness and to schlep it down into the territory of Bina, which is the Ima, and then Bina has the ability of drawing down conscious modes of awareness into Zer Anpin, which is us. Zer Anpin, Banamatem Hashem Elokechem. We are the Merkava for the Partsufim of Za and Nukva da Atzilus. That is the Yichud of Kutchabrichu Vishchintai. That's the Yichud of the Kol and the Dibor, the unifications that are always taking place through our actions. So it turns out that it's specifically in the lowest territory that human beings are going to be able to awaken the truest potency of who we are, which is our Avodas Hashem, our ability to be Mashlim the Yichud. And like we said, this is the entire tachlis that the Ramchal is trying to reveal to us, like all of the tzaddikim, that Hashem wants the lights of above to be revealed down here below, and the only way for the lights of above to be truly revealed in their full potency is when it is through the vehicles of down here below. So the counterintuitive shift that takes place in nearly every page of Pnimius HaTorah is that, yes, the higher is higher and the lower is lower, but it's only by way of descending down into the lower that the higher level will truly be able to be revealed. And this is what's happening, the diminution process, the concealment and the constriction and the tzimtzumim, and the gradational valves of containment that allow the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come into human consciousness, to be part of a functional system without losing that systematicity as a result of the remnant of the infinite light. That's the Seder of the Ishtalshalos, the process of Tzimtzumim and Tikkunim. Tikkunim are all containments for the sake of revelation. Ha-he'elem hu hagiloi. Whenever it comes to graspability, whenever it comes to understanding what Hashem wants from us in this world, it's bechol karenu, a love. Whenever we call out to you, it's directly to you, but we can't directly reach ourselves out to you because you're infinite in all matters of infinitude. And therefore, what we have is the secret of a love b'derech midosav, that by way of investing into Torah and mitzvos and avoda and emuna and nishmas Yisrael, those are the midos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu kaviyachol. And even though the midos are not identifiable with the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nevertheless, it's only by way of the midos that we have the ability to have some element of an achiza and a hamshacha of the Or Ein Sof. The hasaga is only with regards to the limited expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the dveikus, what we're connecting ourselves to, is the unlimited light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's essence. And so now we're going into the next shlav, which is the shvira sakelim, the shattering of the vessels, the cataclysm, the traumatic breakdown between oros and vessels that on the one hand looks like such a mistaken trauma, God forbid, that gives shape to all of the broken nature of existence and the shvira and all of the things that need to be fixed. But on the other hand, when seen in the proper perspective, the descent and the encounter with Kavuros and the Tzimtzumim, yes, they appear to be a divisive descent away from the infinite illumination of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light, but at the same point, it's a Yerida L'Tzorach Aliyah. And just as the Tzimtzum was there to enable the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come into graspability, so too the Shvira is going to enable the next stage of graspability, which is going to be the Binyan HaPartzufim and all of the Tikkunim that take place, the Tikkunim of Atik and Arich, which are all ultimately just lenses that contain in order so that the light of infinitude could be revealed in a graspable way, done by Zer Anpin, which is us, which is Avodah avodas habechira. So this parak is going to be at Olam Hanikudim Shriya Sakelim. We're going to have to reorient this trauma to become this constitutive breaking that builds the entire system. After the developing the worlds of the interiority of Adam Kadmon, HaKadosh Baruch Hu spread out a particular partition, Uba Galif Vishir Malchin, and that's where the estimation and the engraving of those kings, those Edomite kings, which would eventually take shape in existence itself, were being engraved. V'tikunai lo yatkaimu, but the tikunim, the rectifications, the lights in the vessels, did not have the capacity to sustain itself. Hadohu dichsiv, this is what the pasuk says, ve'ilu hamelachim asher malchu be'eretz Edom lifnei melech livnei b'nei Yisrael, that these are the Edomite kings, these are the kings of Edom who lived and they ruled prior to the rulership of Klal Yisrael, the representation of Shvira prior to rectification. Malka kadma'a l'bnei Yisrael kadma'a, that they served in the beginning for the sake of the eventual emergence of Malchei Yisrael, so that the descent and the destruction is ultimately for an ascent and a construction. And they all were set up and they could not maintain themselves, and in accordance with the names that they were given, meaning these Edomite names, because ultimately the tikkun is no different than the tohu, it's just a reshifting of our perspective of it and a reharnessing of that energy, that the names that they were called, the Malchei Edom, that didn't find sustainability. Until that light was hidden away and it was made private. And only afterwards were we able to look back at that parsa, that separation which caused the entire shvira, and look at it in a healthy way. So the Zohar says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu spread out a particular partition. Uba Galif Vishir Malchin, and it's there that the kings were engraved and they were estimated, meaning the estimation and the shape of existence as it's going to unfold is what's taking shape within this womb of Bina, which is the Eretz of Edom, which is the place of Malchei Edom and where the Shvira comes from. The tikkunim were not there. The rectifications were not yet set up properly. The balancing act between the light and the vessels was not yet prepared, and there was no equal distribution of the lights, and therefore the shvira took place. And this is the pasuk. This is what we see at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, fundamental to the entire sequence of history and psychology on every level. These are the Edomite kings who ruled in the town of Edom, in the land of Edom, prior to the rulership of Bnei Yisrael. This is the whole process: shvira and then tikkun, darkness and then light, brokenness and then building. Zok the Heilige Ramchal. What's happening here? What's this parsa? What's this partition? Is this a stage in development? Is this a regression to an earlier stage? What's going on? So Zok the Heilige Ramchal. When it arose within HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will to reveal the Malchin Kadmin, the world of Tohu, those Oros, so that they can descend down and eventually congeal and develop into the Partsufim of the world of Tikkun, the first thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did was Hine Birishoina Paras Masach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to spread out a partition, a tzimtzum, a veil, a wall, an impenetrable level that separates the higher level from the lower level. And impenetrable is not the right word, because ultimately that lower level is nothing but the higher level expressing itself downwards. So it's not that it's impenetrable, it is the very light of the higher level congealing and condensing itself into a limit and a lip that externalizes itself, and it appears to be a barrier that blocks the lower levels from getting up back into the higher levels, but in truth, it's just the sediment and the calcification of the lowest levels of the gevuros of the higher level that become the mesach. And therefore, if we could properly understand that partition and separation and see it not as the secondary element that's added to block out the higher light from the lower light, but rather it's the edge, it's the lip and the externalization, the malchus of that higher light, which congeals and condenses itself into a kli, so that when we access that partition and that privation that blocks us from going up, we are in fact experiencing the very thing that we feel blocked from. That's the paras masach, that's the partition, that's the shorish of the tzimtzum. And the model that we have for this development of the Mesach is what happens in the inner interiority of Adam Kadmon, where at first the lights of Ab and Sag were illuminating the upper territories, and then on the bottom the lights of Ma and Ben were illuminating the lower territories. And then the second Tzimtzum, the Tzimtzum Hasheni, is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu elevates those lights of Ma and Ben that occupied the lower territory of Adam Kadmon from the tabor down to the legs, and he ascended it upwards, and that claustrification and that claustrophobia of all of the light lights joining together, they created a certain collision, and that collision allows for the emergence of a partition. The collision is what allows the lights to congeal, to become more than what they are, and that's what becomes that limit, that lip, so that the lip and the limit is ultimately nothing but the inversion of that interiority that we can't seem to grasp, but it's externalized in the way of its simsum. And even though it's externalized in the way of its simsum, nevertheless, if we were to dig down deep into the very DNA of this thing that is the simsum, we would come to find that it's the very matter that we're trying to get back to. So the gathering of all of those lower levels at the lowest point, they congeal and they become the mesach. Va'az nifrash hapargod. And once there's this congealment of the lower levels that become the calcified element of the higher levels, so to say, so then the pargod is spread out. The partition, the curtain, the veil that separates between levels is spread out. And again, all of this is b'derech hatikun, the containment for the sake of revelation. V'hine bepargod ze nimse gamkein bein ha'olamois ubein atzilus lebria v'chein la'acherim. This pargod takes on its most fundamental shape in between the world of Atzilus and the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So even though here we're talking about a level of Adam Kadmon and the interiority of Adam Kadmon and the emergence of the Shvira, we can better understand what's taking place by looking at a sugya that takes place later on, which is the Mesach and the Pargod that's set up between the world of Atzilus and the world of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. That the halachos of Atzilus are very different than the halachos of Bia. That on a revealed level in the world of Atzilus, the vessels are fundamentally negated to the light, and it's Ihu v'Garmayu v'Chiviyu Chad Bahon. There's a fundamental revelation of Elokus there in those places. In the world of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, in spite of the fact that in the inner interiority levels of the Chaya and the Yechida, the most interior parts of those lower levels, on a level of Or, it's the same hiskalus of that Or of Or Ein Sof, and La'asad level it's going to be an hiskala that it was always only Or Ein Sof, but nevertheless in the worlds of Bia, in the worlds of separation, there are real different halachos. We can't reveal the absolute light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu down here yet. That would be akin to Avodah Zarah, of equating this worldly reality with the presence of godliness. There's a tzimtzum, there's an achiza, the mana'oila, a blockage that prevents us from illuminating the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya in the same way that the worlds of Atzilus are illuminated. And the reason for that is this mesach, this pargod, this lip, this outer limit of the lowest part of Atzilus, which becomes the highest part of Bria. And the secret of the Malchus to Atzilus, which is that it has the ability to be boikea and to be yored down lamata from itself into the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So we see that this mesach, this partition, is also movable, right? There's also a porous border there, but that's only because the lights of Atzilus have this ability to descend down below themselves. But this is the partition, this is the beginning, the separation that separates the levels of absolute unity and the levels of lower unity. And in truth, the worlds and the extension of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya are only extensions of the Pargod itself, because the Pargod itself is the congealment of Malchus Ta'atzilus, and Malchus Ta'atzilus expresses itself in the three levushim of itself, Machshava, Dibur, and Maisa, in the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So the worlds of Bia are byproducts, they're symptoms of that which emerges once the Pargod is set. It's not that, oh, there's Oilam Ha'atzilus, and then we're going to build a divider, and then we're going to build something called the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. The only existence of the unfolding and the externalization of the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, theoretical worlds that where the light of infinite light is not fundamentally revealed, that's only because the infinite light has contained itself by way of the Pargod, and the Pargod gives birth to those worlds. This higher level pargod in the interiority of Adam Kadmon that we're speaking about now, which is that enclosure that forces the lights to grow in their intensity until they reveal themselves, creating the Shvira, this is going to be very similar to the pargod that we're going to see in the worlds of Atzilus and the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So the same halachos that we see by that pargod, which is that, yes, it separates, but also the act of separation is really just the concealment of the higher level for the sake of the revelation of the lower level. So that containment is going to create a duality to the pargod. It's on the one hand going to be something that separates, but on the other hand, it's also going to be something that illuminates and gives the ability for connectivity. Where does the pargod come from? The collision of these lights that are now contained within the inner part of Adam Kadmon that takes shape after the Hamshachas HaPargod, that extension of that partition in the interiority of Adam Kadmon that forces the lights to ascend upwards to create that claustrophobic kind of presencing that forces the lights to extend themselves outwards, which is the secret of the Shvira. That's the nature of the pargod. And what's taking place over here in Adam Kadmon, where in the inner lights the pargod is set and the lower lights can't go down anymore. So there's a growing intensification and a friction, and that inner friction needs to be revealed externally. So those lights then are eventually going to be mispashet bachutz. So what happens is that the kav extends itself into the halal, and the first instantiation of a kli is Adam Kadmon. But in the interiority of Adam Kadmon, it's such a lofty level that we can't yet discuss it. So what happens is that the lights of Adam Kadmon, Absag Ma Ben, so to say, occupy the entirety of Adam Kadmon. But then there's a Tzimtzum Sheni, Katsalik Beruusilim Ivre Alma, when a Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal the next level of concealment, he takes all of the lights, so to say, from the interiority of Adam Kadmon, from beneath that Masach, and takes the lower half of the lights up into the place of the upper half of the lights. And before those lower lights can go back down so that there's a redistribution of energy, there's a pargod that's set, so the lights can no longer go down. And then that intensification and the friction caused by the newfound overwhelming presence of the claustrophobia of lights, it forces the lights to extend themselves outwards through the orifices of Adam Kadmon, so to say, which are the lights of the Oznayim. The first instantiation of the lights that come out are the lights of the Oznayim. The Oznayim are the place of Bina, of Sag, of Yud, Vav, Dalid, Hey, Yud, Vav, Aleph, Vav, Hey, Yud. That's the shirish of all of the Tzimtzum and the Tohu. The light of the Malchim Kadmon come out from the ears, so to speak, of the Chitzonius of Adam Kadmon. And that's what we're seeing here, that this pargod forces the lights now to reveal themselves, which is going to create the Shira. Ube'emes ha-pargod hazeh hutztrach l'mayit ha'or l'tzarich bria. The necessity of this pargod, the necessity of this containment and this separation, this partition is necessary so that when the lights emerge, they can minimize themselves slowly but surely. And this is what the Shira represents. It's the first instantiation and infantile stage of the emergence of vessels. And the first attempt is something that breaks, but the breaking is not accidental. It's a deliberate breaking because the only way to build something is to break it. This needed to be done in order to be memayit, to minimize the light. As we're going to explain it as we have explained. And even in that place, like we said, the pargod, the tzimtzum, that which separates Atzilus and Bria, is always going to be Bina. What is Bina? Bina is the externalization of the lowest part of Chachma. It's the Malchus of Chachma that externalizes itself so that it becomes this thing that appears to be opposite Chachma. It blocks the world of Atzilus, and it allows for the worlds of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya to take shape afterwards. But in truth, the very pargod itself is the externalization of Chachma, which begins to look like Bina. And in this pargod is the first engraving and the creation of all of these potencies that are going to emerge afterwards in the secret of Olam HaTohu. Besod Gilufin V'Shiur, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is engraving and measuring, B'chol Hispashtus HaOros, the measure of all of the lights that are going to extend afterwards. Ulefi Mashen Nizman B'Pargoid Kach Yatzu HaOros Mimenu Lamata Ad Seif HaGuf. And afterwards, once that pargod was in place, then the lights descend outwards and it creates this beginning of the Tohu, the beginning of the first expression of the potencies in their overwhelmed state, so that we can begin to learn how to contain them. This first pargod that stands to separate the lights so that the lights are now going to emerge outwards because of the intensification in the inside, which is being created by the samshachas of a pargod, this blockage that prevents the lights from going back down. This creates the collision of the lights in the interiority of Adam Kadmon, so to say, which is eventually going to express itself in the shvira and the externality of Adam Kadmon. The pargod is a mesach, it's a partition, and a mesach is a mem sameches, which is gematria 120, which is oile kuf chaf, which is the kuf chaf tzirufei elokim. That a 5-letter word has the ability to be permeated in 120 ways. And the shem elokim, that's the dinim de kedusha. Those are the gevuros. Elokim acherim are what happened after those 120 iterations of elokim. But the 120 iterations of elokim are the holy dinim that stand to serve as the containment to allow for a furthering. Shakan hetchelu ha-elokim lehisgalus b'sod ha-malchim kadben k'moshe tishma b'siyata d'shmaya. The reason Mesach is the gematria of 120 tzirufim of elokim is because this first instantiation of limitation that sets in motion the entire eventual unfolding of the Olam HaTohu and the Misas HaMalachim and the shattering of the Edomite kings is taking shape over here in the interiority of Adam Kadmon. And the secret of a pargod, what's a pargod? A pargod is par, which is the par dinim of Man Sapach Mem Nun Sadi Pei Ches Chaf, which are the osios ha'achronos, which end the word, which represent the ending or a din, and that's the par dinim. And So par good is par plus Yud Gimel. Yud Gimel is when you spell out Elokim in its shlemus, there's Yud Gimel Osios. So the par good represents the Elokim that's congealing and creating this limitation, which is the externalization of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light. The secret of the par dinim, which are manspach, which are the 5 letters of Elokim, the 5 letters that are Sophie, that are the gematria of par, which represent the limitation. But emes kan nizdamnu gam kin tikunim haruim le'elyonim atzmam. And in truth, everything we're talking about here and all of the setup behavior to enable the unfolding of the future lights on the lower level is all in truth there to ensure that the upper level is able to fulfill itself in its most potency, meaning to say the levels of Ab and Sag. The whole unfolding of the Shvira and the emergence of the Shvira is the lights of Ma and Ben, the lower worlds, Das Tachton. But ultimately, this emergence of Das Tachton is only there for the sake of propagating and revealing the illumination of Das Elyon in an even higher way. The Shvira of the Tachtonim is for the sake of the Elyonim. Kihem netaknim min Tachtonim shem netkatsharim bam umislabshem b'tzeichim, because ultimately the rectification of the higher levels is when they have the ability to express themselves downwards in viable vessels, which can only be formed by that which is below. V'hinekan haisa shvira, and this is the beginning of the shvira. The pargod is the first instantiation of the shvira that leads to the misas hamalachim. And now we're going to descend down and to understand all of the matters. V'soid ha'inyan, and the secret of the matter is ve'ela Eloikim ve'ela hamalachim asher b'malchu be'eretz Edom. These are the kings who lived in Edom and who ruled in Edom. It cannot be understated as to how significant it is for all of the tzaddikim to see what the Arizal is doing, that the misas of the Malchim Kadmon, which is ultimately coming from the Ijarabba itself, this cataclysm, the shattering of the original kings, is ultimately the bedrock and the point of initiation of the entire unfolding of the Seder Ashtalshalas. So ultimately, one of the most important things here is that it's giving us a shape that all beginnings come about by way of this collision, by way of this emergence, this too muchness. And it very often appears as a trauma, but when we learn the systematicity of it and the purposefulness behind it and the precision behind it, then we have the ability of extrapolating from this shvira and applying it to our lives as well, and the transhistorical shvirot, and to understand that they're fundamentally rooted in the ontology and the script in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal himself. And by that, we're mamtek all of the dinim. We take the Malchim Kadmon and we allow it to be a process that is perpetually unfolding, the taming of that Edomite chaos of an unhinged imagination and rectifying it into kelim of dimyon mezuchach, of the ability to rectify and build perspectives where it could become a tmunas Hashem yabit, where we can come to understand that on the one hand, that we have no ability to be masig any tmuna, and there's no tmuna whatsoever, there's no image, there's no shape, but nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal himself by way of the containment of the partzufim and the shemos, and we have to be able to balance both of these together, be'ezras Hashem, to reveal the Das Elyon within the vessels of Das Tachton, be'ezras Hashem.